You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. There's so many ways that we can give back, even in our jobs, that don't appear to be focused on improving community. My guest today is a woman who is the Senior Vice President, Bank Community Engagement at the American Bankers Association. And she's also the Executive Director of the American Bankers Association Foundation. And so you would not think of banks necessarily as places where people contribute to community, but this person has this as part of her North Star, contributing back to community. My guest, Lindsay Torrico, is a movement builder. She's a community advocate, and she's an industry disruptor. She's committed to centering and anchoring community in driving economic mobility and wealth generation. She wants to help companies and organizations do the work of authentic engagement and deep listening with communities to transform the economic conditions of our most financially distressed neighborhoods. Through mission-driven strategies, she empowers and mobilizes banks of all sizes to promote financial capability, foster resilient communities, and advocate home ownership and wealth building for all. Lindsay, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Thank you, Art. I have been a longtime supporter and fan of this podcast, so I am truly honored to join you today, and thank you for having me.
So, Lindsay, I wanted to get you on this show because I do believe that there is a connection to building community in almost any job that a person has. But in your case, it looks like the American Bankers Association has slotted out a role for someone to help the American Bankers Association actually connect banks to community work. Talk about that some.
Yeah, thanks so much, Art. I think that there is a common thread of community throughout my career, and particularly for this role, it really is about how do we make sure community is at the center of the economic solutions and strategies for everyone. And that includes communities that have been underserved and underrepresented. I am really honored to be in this role and that the American Bankers Association sees the value of investing in this type of work in community. I have been really encouraged by the conversations that I have with banks all across the country that community is what's driving economic growth in their communities. There's an acknowledgement and a recognition that community is must be at the center of this work. And my role is to help provide the solutions, the resources, the ideas, and the passion behind it. So this has been a joy for me and really at an exciting time in my work.
Well, you mentioned that this has been a critical part of your career in general. You've had some other roles where you were actually working in the nonprofit sector at the United Way, I believe. So talk about that too. And how did you decide that nonprofit work and community work was going to be the right fit for you?
Well, I think for me, I always was interested in policy. I'll start with that because I started my career working in Capitol Hill working in local government. And I recognized that there was a real need to look at policies at all levels to help people at the local level and then have that connection to people at the federal level so that you could really have a pulse on what are the challenges within communities. And so I felt uniquely positioned when I was at United Way to understand what are the unique local challenges within communities and to have that access to policymakers at the federal level and share here's what we're listening. Here are the challenges. Here are the opportunities to address economic challenges within these communities. So that connection between federal policy and local community engagement and understanding was very much a key part of how I looked at this work. And my work at United Way was really a beautiful opportunity to make those connections at the state, the local, the federal, and even the global level, so that we could roll up what are we hearing locally and then make some big federal, international, in some cases, policy changes that impact people's lives at scale.
Yeah, well, that makes sense that you would end up in such a role, given your interest in policy. I think there's so much that we can potentially leave on the table if we're not focused on policy as nonprofit organizations in particular. You know, we all go about our work trying to achieve our missions, but we're also so connected in ways with other entities, with people and systems, that if we're not focused on policy, I think our effect is going to be somewhat limited. But if we are focused on policy and getting our government leaders and others to see the change that we want to create and actually begin implementing that, then we can have a much larger impact. But it's not easy, is it? Tell me about the difficulties in getting policy change in a world, particularly one that is, I would say, pretty polarized right now.
Yeah, you hit on it, Art. And I used to tell United Ways all the time at the local level that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That was the phrase we often use in Washington, D.C. Because if we truly want to have an impact in these communities, we have to be in the rooms at the tables of the decision makers. Right? To have an impact at scale, where we're not just helping to support a dozen or 100 people, we want to impact the lives of millions, we have to be at these policy discussions. And so one of the challenges often for nonprofits is being able to have the capacity and the bandwidth and the funds to be able to support policy and advocacy work. That was a challenge I often experienced at United Way Worldwide, is how do we make sure that we are investing in this work and that we have the necessary resources to put towards it. So prioritizing that as a nonprofit is step one, and then trying to figure out how you can resource it and use volunteers, leverage technology to be able to do it effectively is a key part of it.
Yeah, policy is critical. And, you know, I have to plug our organization that we work together in as volunteers, Convergence Policy. One of the challenges with getting policy passed is that we seem to be pretty divided as a nation in most things. I won't just say some things, in most things. If you can come up with a solution, there are probably 20 people out there that see it differently and want to probably push it in a different direction. How is it that we can work together to solve problems? I mean, I know convergence is a solution, and I know you joined the board for one because you actually believe that too. But what are you seeing, Lindsay, in the policy space that gives us some hope?
That's such a good question. It's such a loaded question, Art. I think this is really one of the greatest challenges of our times. I think social media in particular has really exacerbated the polarization in our communities. And I joined the board of Convergence because I do see hope. I do see that there are solutions and there are ways that we can come together. I think the model that Convergence provides, which is really ultimately about connection, human connection. How do we provide opportunities for people to understand each other and fully understand where we have shared values, starting with that, and then you can get to solving the policy challenges. But it really first has to start with connection, community, finding those areas of shared values. And from there is that I think with that as a foundation, start to identify what are the big areas of consensus to drive policy change. But that has been the beauty of Convergence, and that is why I'm so passionate about this work and the methodology to create these spaces and places where people can come together and solve these solutions together.
Yeah. Lindsay, when you think about banking, we tend to think about using money, using leverage, using all types of even power, because money comes with power, or power comes with money. And yet, it's so interesting to me that you have, through the American Bankers Association, this focus on community, which is, kind of interesting because communities, many of them can be very powerless, can be very poor, can be very underserved. And so how do you see the American Bankers Association driving banking to share this power in such a way that communities can thrive?
I think it starts with reframing how we think about power. How do we think about um, what is profitable for a bank? One of my roles at the ABA Foundation, at the American Bankers Association, is to help banks understand that there's a win-win proposition when we help communities, right? It's not just about giving a handout or a check or patting the back, helping somebody in need, but that when our communities are strong, our banks are strong. So, how do we make sure that we provide that win win proposition so that banks understand that investing communities can ultimately be profitable for them? They can expand their customer base, they can get more deposits, they can support more small businesses. These are all good things for banks. But it's reframing how we think about this work. That's not just about giving to a few, but how are we investing in our communities in a way that we all can be effective businesses as well. And so that's really where my focus is identifying what's that ROI? What's that ROI for investing in community engagement and for serving all of us so that we can all be successful and financially stable?
Yeah. So how are you going about this? Are there some programs that you want to highlight that you're working through the
Yeah,
American?
there's a couple of things. One is a lot of our work at the foundation has been focused on financial education, and that really is fundamental for everything. It's making sure that people are educated on how do you build credit, how do you pay down your debt, how do you save for the future. That, of course, is a critical piece of it. But the other piece is making sure that people have the resources to build wealth, and that includes housing, right? So we are doing some programming around housing affordability. This past summer, we launched a program called Unlocking Homeownership, where we provide banks with resources to help their customers and communities be mortgage ready and avoid foreclosure, because we don't want just people buying homes. We want to make sure that they're sustainable in home ownership. So we're doing a lot of programming around that as well. And the second piece is around community conversations. So this past spring, we launched an effort called a Community Conversations Guide, where we provided every bank in the country with a guide to facilitate listening sessions, authentic conversations with community members to really understand what are the local needs in my community, what are the assets within the community, and where are the gaps. Where can we really work together in partnership with community organizations to address some of those challenges and create inclusive economic solutions? So those are some of the key levers that we're focused on. And then moving forward, we're going to be doing a lot more work around how do we help low and moderate income communities build wealth. There's a perception often that, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't have enough to think about your future. You can't get beyond that. So how do we help people get beyond just the living paycheck to paycheck part and think about their financial future, how to build wealth for themselves and their families? And there are ways to do that. And how do we help banks along their journey of educating and supporting their customers in doing that work? So that's really the key sort of pillars of our work is building access and opportunity for everyone in this country to succeed.
Yeah, housing is a particularly tough one because I think anecdotally about young people who have student loan debt and the prices of housing, and right now the interest rates are higher than they've been because of what we went through in the 2008, 2010 period. Banks and underwriters are going to be a lot more careful about the types of tools and vehicles they are able to enable people to get loans. And so, it's a tough road to hoe to actually own a home, it seems, in many places. And yet, that is, from my understanding, the key to wealth creation, right? Having a home where you can build equity, and over time, you have these assets that you can borrow against and do other things with. You want to start a business. So many people have used that route in America to, as you say, create wealth. And for many now, it's more of a dream than a potential reality. So what are your ideas about how we can begin addressing that? And it may not just be the banks alone, but what are you thinking we need to do to maybe begin shifting this very difficult challenge? And I'll just ask you, is home ownership a desire that people have anymore? Is it something that they even think about?
It's such a good question. And I think, especially for millennials and for Gen Z, they find that it's so far out of reach. It's not even something that they're considering, which is unfortunate. It is not a silver bullet, as we know. But as you mentioned, it allows people to build assets for themselves and for their families. I think it does take a multifaceted approach. There is no one single way to provide people with homes. And I was at a conference just last week where there was a discussion about the housing supply crisis, and that just getting people in homes is not a solution in itself because there aren't enough homes.
Right.
So how do we address, there's affordability issue, and there's also a supply issue as well. So how do we address both of those pieces? It's going to take a multifaceted approach. And a lot of it is at the local level. I think that's often why housing policy just feels like this sort of complicated, overwhelming issue, because it is about often local zoning policies, what a community can and can't do. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of efforts recently at the local level to provide more flexibility to build more homes, but that's one piece of it. Another piece is around developers and making sure that there's more developers of color and that developers are incentivized to provide housing in low to moderate income communities. And then there's another piece that's just around what are innovative solutions to address this problem? There's been a lot of really exciting work around manufactured housing, asset dwelling units. How do we utilize buildings that are not being used right now because people are working remotely, and how do we convert them into residential homes, which apparently is a very costly and a high left for a lot of developers. So it's going to take all of those pieces coming together. And there's great work happening at the local level. I'm really encouraged by that, but it's going to take a lot of work in a number of different angles to address it.
I'm really fascinated by this thought of buildings, particularly office buildings, being converted into residences. And obviously, with more and more people working from home and the struggle that commercial real estate may be having right now because people are looking for ways out of their leases. People are looking for ways to jettison their office space because they're not needing as much. And you even see local cities creating policies where people have to come to work now because they're worried about what's going on with these facilities and what it means for downtown economic development. It's fascinating. One solution could be to begin converting. If we have a shortage in homes, why not use some of those facilities for that?
Yeah, it's absolutely being explored in a number of cities. And I think one of the challenges is making sure that the community is a, is one that is walkable. Um, that because often these commercial locations aren't necessarily ideal for residential, right? So you have to think beyond just that building, but think about the larger community. What are the schools like? So it's one of those issues that has ripple effects and it raises a number of questions. But I think it's certainly something that is being explored and is certainly a win-win for both the community and for businesses that are looking to sell their leases.
So, how does the American Bankers Association and the foundation collaborate with maybe nonprofits and maybe other businesses for that matter to enable the mission that you set out?
Yeah, a lot of it is focused on our work around community conversations and how do we bridge these gaps between community organizations and banks to bring them together to have conversations, to start to build those sustainable partnerships. The other interesting piece is as we develop this resource for banks, we started hearing from nonprofits. We want to understand what do we need to know about the banking industry so that we can be better partners. So we're also working on developing a similar resource for nonprofits on what do you need to know about sort of the business of banking so that you can pursue better relationships with banks. And so again, it's sort of looking at it from different angles to bring these two core groups together to address some economic challenges, because often nonprofits don't understand how companies run, right? And so that has been an eye-opening for me as I've transitioned from community organizations to more on the for-profit side, is recognizing that there's real differences in how we talk about these issues. The terminology is completely different. And so, how do we translate sort of the business speak to nonprofits and vice versa so that we're understanding each other, so that we can be better partners together on the ground? So that's really the focus of that work.
So, what's been most eye-opening to you since your transition to ABA?
I think what's been most eye-opening is understanding that banks, I think, like a lot of companies, do care about community. They do value community, but the question is how. It's often a question of how do we do this in a way that's going to have the most impact, and who are the right partners, and how do we make sure to do this in a way that's not transactional, right? Because I think many companies can certainly give a check and wipe their hands and hope for the best. But the questions that I often get from banks is we want to be part of the solution. So, how do we, in partnership with community, address these big challenges together? We're not sure how we even get started in that, in addressing a big issue like housing affordability or building wealth or helping somebody with access to credit issues. And so providing those roadmaps for them, if you're really focused on, building wealth or helping somebody buy a home or providing those specific resources on here's how you get started. Like many nonprofits, I think are in a similar boat of trying to figure out how are you most effective with the resources you have? And so that really is the question that I'm often asked is how can we do this in a way that's the most impactful? And for me, it's about understanding community needs. It has to start there because if you don't know what the community needs are, what the challenges are, you're going to be short-sighted in finding the right solution. So it really has to start with that. And then from there, identifying what are your goals, what are your strategic goals that are aligned with, in many cases for banks, what's aligned with the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. And then from there, what are the metrics, what's the data, and what are the right programs that are going to make the most impact for the most people in your footprint. So those are the areas we're really focused on. Again, it's providing those really specific, tangible how-to opportunities so that they know how they can really make the greatest impact in their communities.
Are banks able to make a business case for some of this work, especially the work that focuses on communities of color, where there's now some pushback for work
Right.
specifically targeted to those groups? Are we able to make progress by making a business case? You see that happening at all, Lindsay, or am I?
It's so funny you asked that because I had a bank that asked me that question last week, and he's trying to internally make the case for this work within the bank. And he said, what can you give me? I need to make my pitch, right, to my boss why support this work. What I'll say is it's difficult, and I think this goes for nonprofit business to make that direct link. You invest this amount of money, you're going to get this specific outcome. We all know that there's so many external variables that's a challenging thing to do. But what we have seen, we have case studies of banks that have seen an increase in deposits, an increase in customers, more customer loyalty when they invest in these types of products and services. And one of my greatest examples is a bank, small bank, community bank in Reading, Massachusetts called Reading Cooperative Bank. And they made the decision a few years ago that they were going to open up a branch in a majority minority community, in a largely Spanish speaking community. And there was internal and external pushback. And they started with community conversations and talking to the community. And they trained their staff on cultural competency. They had staff members that spoke Spanish, and they made those decisions. And ultimately, it's one of their most profitable branches. And that is such a shining star, I think, for so many banks and companies that when you make those decisions and you do it in a way that brings community along and communities at the center of it, that it can be that win-win and there can be that return on investment. So my job is to really be that cheerleader for that bank and to lift up other examples where we've seen that this is profitable and this is an effective business case for banks and for all companies, I think, to invest in community.
Oh, great. Well, Lindsay, we're going to leave it there, but let me just thank you, first of all, for the great opportunity that I've had to work with you at Convergence as a board member there. I've got to see just how brilliant and thoughtful you are, not only about work in general, but about people. And it's been so delightful to get to know you and share the space of creating a less polarized country with you. And I also just wanted to congratulate you for your job at the American Bankers Association, where you're trying to connect banks to communities in deeper and more fulfilling and enriching ways to really develop those places that need help. And finally, I just wanted to comment that I don't know, many people don't talk as much about the work that women are doing in general. I know you have a family that you're managing, you have your work that you're doing, and you also find time to volunteer. And we don't see people who are doing the kinds of things that you're doing like that held up. And I just wanted to use you, if you don't mind, as an example for what people can do. It's not easy, of course, but you manage somehow. And if you're looking for an example of someone who is putting it all together, I don't want to call you a superwoman because that terminology doesn't make any sense in this world. But I'm just so impressed by how you keep it all in balance and make it happen. So I just wanted to say that.
Oh, well, you warmed my heart, Art. That is so kind. And I'm so grateful for all of the opportunities that I have had. Truly, it's a blessing. It really is to do the work that I love and to be able to continue to um, support my family and to volunteer for causes that I care about. So I am blessed by all of these opportunities, and I'm grateful to you for this platform and this opportunity to talk about the work that I'm doing. And thank you, Art. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, you've been listening to Lindsay Torrico, and she is the Senior Vice President, Bank Community Engagement at the American Bankers Association. And she's also the Executive Director of its foundation. And what a great conversation we've had. If you're listening to this podcast for the first time, know that it is a weekly show. And each week we come out with a new edition on Tuesday. And I hope you'll subscribe. You can subscribe on any major podcast platform for the audio. And for the video, you can go to the BBB Wise Giving Alliance's YouTube page and get all of the video that we shot of these shows as well. So I want to thank you for listening, and I hope we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.